Hello and welcome back to another daily Top 10's Top 10 video. Today we're looking at how the Black Death, one of humanity's biggest atrocities, helped to shape the modern world. 10. Opportunity. Before the Black Death, towns and cities were crowded, jobs were few and far between, and living conditions were atrocious. It was not a pleasant time to live, even when you exclude the constant threat of being ravaged by the seemingly unstoppable disease. However, once the Black Death had thinned out the numbers, opportunity was rife. Workers found more jobs and commanded higher wages. They were able to provide for themselves and for their families, and they were able to live better and more comfortably.
The population was tremendous, and the cities were big, crowded, but they were also very wealthy places to live, and so attracting lots of people. So in a sense, it's the sort of place that a disease is going to love.
9. Comedy. A lot of medieval entertainment was considered to be the work of the devil, but gradually they began to realize that people needed to laugh, and that laughter in itself could be a useful medicine. This belief was strengthened by the spread of the Black Death and the dark times that followed, which helped to pave the way for forms of comedy that had been previously banned. 8. Perfume. Doctors believed that the Black Death was caused by miasmas, or bad smells. The reason they wore those horror movie masks with the long noses was because those noses were stuffed with fragrant flowers and spices, which they believed would ward off bad smells and stop the disease from getting through. This had little basis in truth, but it did help kickstart the perfume industry, as the belief in miasmas continued even after the Black Death. Seven. English. The English language was spoken throughout England, but it wasn't Latin that made it into textbooks and was taught at universities. However, many Latin-educated scholars were wiped out by the plague, so schools and universities were forced to hire people who hadn't been formally educated. These future teachers and professors knew nothing of Latin, but they did speak English, so they began to teach this to their students. English became the official language of the courts in the middle of the 14th century. 6. The middle class. Prior to the Black Death, there were the haves and the have-nots, the upper class and the lower class. But after the Black Death, and thanks to the increased opportunities, much of the lower class became wealthier than they had ever been. They weren't quite upper class, but they certainly weren't poor either. And so the middle class was created, and husbands everywhere suddenly became very annoyed with the neighbors' kids always playing on their lawn. 5. Healthier people. The reason some people survived the plague and others didn't might have something to do with their genetic makeup. Modern science has discovered that many survivors had a genetic resistance to the disease, possibly built up over many generations. This allowed them to pass the gene on to their other family members, creating a cycle that eventually helped to stop the spread of disease. It may also mean that modern Europeans are much more resistant to disease than their ancestors were, and indeed than those of Asian or African descent are. 4. Migration. Before the Black Death, it was uncommon for people to leave the towns and cities they grew up in. After the Black Death, inner city families realized that they could lead a better life in the country, while estate owners and farm owners began contracting work to people in nearby towns and cities. These workers essentially operated like modern handymen, traveling here and there to work as when needed. 3. Humanity. The Black Death did not discriminate based on class. Everyone suffered, and everyone who survived witnessed that suffering. Life had been very difficult until that point, and human life was not valued. However, that changed when the spread of disease slowed, and the humanist movement took root. Art, reason, logic, and humanity took center stage and played an integral role in the lives of most Europeans, which in turn helped to shape the centuries that followed.
More cruel, more pitiless than war had descended upon us. This was not God's work, but witchcraft.
Word has reached the bishop of a village that does not suffer as the rest.
I must see for myself how this village is kept safe.
2. Literacy. For many hundreds of years, the literacy rates in Europe have been astonishingly low. In the middle of the 14th century, when the plague was at its peak, they were around 5%. However, thanks to improved wealth and opportunity, as well as the other advancements that the Black Death triggered, these rates had risen to around 50% by the late 18th century. And number 1, hospitals. Although hospitals existed before and during the Black Death, these were not places where the sick and injured were cured and treated. There were no doctors nor nurses in these hospitals, and they were often staffed by monks who knew very little about medicine, and often ordered the patients into a prayer or a repentance. As the disease spread, hospitals began to change, and when the pestilence had subsided, these hospitals began to take on a form that we would recognize today, helping to trigger huge advancements in medieval medicine. Unfortunately, that's all we have for right now. Thanks for watching, and remember, it's our duty to entertain and yours to subscribe.